What does it take for a barren heart to finally bloom? For some, it takes a miracle. For others, it takes a second chance. But for Arthur, a man whose soul was as cracked and dry as the land under his feet, it took a $10 ranch at the end of the world and a woman who asked him to milk her as if she were a cow. His story doesn't begin with hope. It begins with an ending. It begins in the desolate, sun-scorched heart of a forgotten county, a place where dust and despair were the only crops that ever grew true. This is where Arthur, his face a roadmap of grief carved by 47 hard years, came to disappear. The ranch he bought wasn't a home. It was a tomb he'd purchased for the price of a cheap bottle of whiskey, a final, quiet surrender. He stood in the decaying barn, the air thick with the smell of rot and forgotten time. The wooden beams groaned above him, skeletal fingers reaching for a sky the color of rust. This was it, the last stop. He was the last remnant of a proud farming family, a name that once meant something in these parts, now reduced to a ghost haunting his own memories. He had watched his wife, Martha, fade away like a photograph left in the sun, her laughter slowly replaced by the sterile silence that now filled his every waking moment. He had sold his ancestral land, acre by painful acre, to pay for treatments that only delayed the inevitable. Each sale was a fresh wound, another piece of his soul traded for a few more quiet, desperate days. Now, utterly alone, he was a king of nothing, ruling over an empire of dust and regret. It was in the deepest shadows of that barn, huddled behind a pile of rotted hay, that he saw her. At first, he thought she was an animal, a stray dog or a coyote seeking shelter from the oppressive heat. But then she moved, and the thin sliver of light from a cracked board fell across a human face. She looked more like a feral creature than a person, her hair a tangled mess, her clothes little more than rags. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were wide with a fear so profound, so ancient, it seemed to have consumed her very voice, leaving nothing but a terrified silence in its wake. Arthur, a man who thought he had seen the depths of human suffering, found himself looking at something far beyond his understanding. He stood frozen, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He was not a man prone to fear, but this was different. This was an intrusion of the impossible into his carefully constructed end. A long, tense silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the dusty air. He could hear the frantic beat of her heart, or maybe it was his own. He took a half-step forward, his boots crunching on the dry, brittle floorboards. He meant to say something, to ask who she was, what she was doing here, but the words caught in his throat. What did it matter? This place was a monument to things that no longer mattered. Then she spoke. Her voice was a dry whisper, a sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement, and the words she uttered were so bizarre, so utterly alien to his bleak reality, that they shattered the world around him. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, and with a desperate, trembling plea, she asked him to milk her. The shock was absolute, a physical jolt that ran through him. For a moment, he was certain he had finally lost his mind, that the grief and the loneliness had finally cracked him open. He stared at her, this wild woman, in his derelict barn, and saw not madness, but a desperation that mirrored his own. It was a moment of profound absurdity in a life that had already been stripped of all meaning. Who was she? How did she get here? These questions paled in comparison to the one that burned at the forefront of his mind. Why would she ask for something so impossible? He looked around the empty barn, at the stalls that once held prize-winning dairy cows, a legacy he had sold off long ago. He was a farmer without a farm, a husband without a wife, a man without a purpose. And you watching this right now, have you ever felt that way? Judged by everyone on the outside, while a storm of unspoken truth rages within you? Have you ever been so misunderstood by the world that a moment of pure madness felt like the only sane option left? Arthur didn't know it then, but Elara, as she would one day be known to him, was as much a part of this land as the dirt itself. She was the last of a lineage tied to the earth in a way. The modern world had forgotten, a secret kept by the very soil she inhabited. She carried within her a biological anomaly, a gift or a curse, depending on who was looking. Her own secluded family had seen it as a curse, a shameful secret to be hidden away. She was treated as an unnatural burden, a creature to be fed and sheltered but never seen, never known. After her guardians passed, she was simply left behind, abandoned on the property, and sold along with it for $10, as if she were Nothing more than a piece of rusted equipment or a stray head of livestock. Her trauma wasn't born from a single event, but from a lifetime of being dehumanized, her unique gift twisted into a mark of monstrosity. All she had ever wanted was to find a place where her existence wasn't a stain, where she could be a part of the natural cycle she felt humming in her own blood. Her bizarre request was not an act of insanity. It was an act of pure survival, a desperate attempt to connect with the one person who had stumbled into her solitary world. Arthur saw none of this. He saw only a reflection of his own profound isolation. He was haunted by the ghost of the life he was supposed to live, a life filled with the laughter of children he and Martha never had, the smell of freshly tilled earth, the simple, honest rhythm of growth and harvest. The purchase of this worthless ranch hadn't been an investment. It was a pilgrimage to the site of his own demise. But deep down, buried beneath layers of grief, was a secret desire he barely admitted to himself. It wasn't to reclaim his wealth or his status. It was to feel a single, fleeting flicker of purpose again, to care for something, anything, that might grow under his broken, calloused hands. And so, driven by a strange cocktail of pity and a loneliness so vast it bordered on madness, he complied. He found an old, rusted bucket, rinsing it with the last of the clean water from his canteen. The act felt surreal, a dream from which he was sure he would soon wake. He knelt before her in the dirt and shadows, the world outside fading away until there was only the two of them in the cavernous silence of the barn. It was a moment of profound, shared vulnerability. A broken man and a feral woman, bound together by a request that defied all logic. He expected nothing, or perhaps he expected the final, definitive proof of his own insanity. He was a farmer. This was a motion his hands knew, a muscle memory from a life that felt like it, belonged to someone else. But what flowed into the bucket was not milk. It was a luminous, silvery liquid that seemed to capture the faint light, swirling with an internal energy that hummed against the metal. It was beautiful and impossible. As he shifted, a few drops spilled from the bucket onto the cracked, barren earth of the barn floor. The ground there was like concrete, baked hard by a decade of relentless sun and neglect, a place where not even a weed could find purchase. But where the liquid touched the earth, something extraordinary happened. A patch of vibrant, impossible wildflowers instantly sprang forth. They bloomed in a matter of seconds, their petals unfurling in a silent explosion of color, deep blues, radiant purples, and fiery oranges, a stark and stunning defiance of the decay that surrounded them. Arthur pulled back his hands as if he'd been burned, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the flowers, then at the silvery liquid in the bucket, then at the woman huddled before him. The fear in her eyes was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a fragile, questioning hope. This single, miraculous event didn't bring him joy. It ignited a terror so profound it made his blood run cold. He had not stumbled upon a simple curiosity. He had unearthed a secret that the world was not ready for, a miracle that felt more like a curse. In that moment, he understood that his quiet plan to fade into nothing was over. He had wanted a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, and the universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had answered. He looked at the impossible flowers blooming in the dirt, a splash of life in a world of death. They were a promise and a threat, a promise of renewal, of a life he thought was lost to him forever, and a threat of discovery, of a world that would seek to understand, to control, and ultimately to destroy something it could not comprehend. His quiet, desolate ranch was no longer a place to die. It had become a sanctuary for a secret that defied all of nature's laws. He was no longer just a grieving farmer. He was the guardian of a miracle, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that protecting it would demand more from him than he had left to give. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the barn floor. The vibrant colors of the wildflowers seemed to glow with a light of their own, a beacon of impossible life in the encroaching darkness. Arthur looked at Ilara, who had not moved, her eyes still fixed on his, waiting. He saw the lifetime of fear etched into her features, but for the first time he also saw the person beneath the feral exterior. He saw a soul as barren as his own, waiting for something, anything, to grow. He had come here seeking an end, a final, merciful silence. Instead, he had found a beginning, one that was terrifying and fragile and shimmering with an impossible light. He slowly stood up, the rusted bucket feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. The world he had known, the one governed by debt and death and decay, had been irrevocably broken. A new world had just been born in the dust of his barn, a world of silvery liquid and instant blooms. He didn't know what would happen next, or what dangers this new reality would bring. All he knew was that for the first time in years, the silence that had followed him like a shadow was filled with a question, not of how he would die, but of how he would possibly manage to live. The barren soil of his heart had just felt its first impossible drop of rain, and he was terrified of what might begin to grow. The days that followed were a blur of suspended disbelief. Arthur moved through his new reality like a man in a waking dream. The impossible sight of those wildflowers burned onto the back of his eyelids. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, a riot of color blooming from nothing, a defiant scream of life in the cathedral of decay that was his barn. He had come to this place to be swallowed by the silence, to let the dust settle over him as it had over everything else. But the silence was now broken, not by a sound, but by a question that echoed in the deepest chambers of his soul. What had he found? And more terrifyingly, what was he supposed to do with it? He began a fragile, unspoken routine with the woman, Ilara. He would leave food, a piece of bread, a can of beans he'd brought with him, at the edge of the shadows where she hid. He never saw her take it, but it was always gone when he returned. And each evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he would approach with the old rusted bucket, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and repeat the surreal ritual. To understand the weight of this miracle, you have to understand the man it fell upon. Arthur Miller was not born a ghost. He was born from the very soil he now felt so alienated from. The Millers had been farming this county for 4 generations. His father, a man carved from oak and stubbornness, believed the land was a living thing. It had a memory, a spirit, and it demanded respect, sweat, and blood. Arthur grew up with the smell of turned earth in his nostrils and the weight of a legacy on his shoulders. He was taught that a man's worth was measured by the straightness of his furrows and the fullness of his harvest. His father's hands were maps of a hard-won life, calloused and cracked, but they were hands that could coax life from the most unforgiving clay. Arthur inherited those hands, but he feared he had never inherited the spirit that moved them. He had always felt like a paler version of his father, a shadow striving to live up to a brilliant, unyielding sun. Then came Martha. She was not from farming stock. She was a town girl, a librarian's daughter who saw the world in stories and poetry. When she looked at Arthur, she didn't see a farmer's son struggling under the weight of expectation. She saw a quiet strength, a kindness in his eyes that the dust and the sun could not hide. Their love was a simple, sturdy thing, built on shared silences and easy laughter. They married young, their future stretching before them like a freshly ploughed field, full of promise. They lived in the old family farmhouse, the one Arthur had just abandoned, and filled its quiet halls with dreams. Their biggest dream, the one they whispered to each other in the dark, was of children. A son with Arthur's hands and Martha's smile. A daughter to run through the fields of corn, her laughter carried on the summer wind. They dreamed of filling the empty rooms, of continuing the Miller line, of giving the land the one thing it truly needed, a future. But the field of their future remained fallow. Year after year, the cradle in the attic, the one Arthur's father had made for him, collected dust. The silence in the farmhouse began to change. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with unspoken grief. Each new season brought a fresh sting of failure. They watched their neighbors' children grow, marking the passage of time in ways they could not. It was the first great barrenness in Arthur's life, a quiet, gnawing sorrow that settled deep in their marriage. And you, who are listening to this story, have you ever felt that kind of emptiness? A dream so vital to your very being that its absence feels like a physical part of you is missing. It was a wound they learned to live with, a ghost that sat with them at the dinner table. They poured their love into the land instead, their crops becoming the children they could never have. For a time, it was enough. Then the second, more brutal barrenness arrived. It started as a whisper in Martha's health, a persistent cough, a weariness that sleep could not cure. The whispers grew into a diagnosis, a clinical, heartless word that shattered their world. The doctors spoke of treatments, of odds, of things that cost more money than Arthur had ever seen. He didn't hesitate. He began to sell the land. The first parcel to go was the north pasture, the one with the ancient oak tree where he and Martha had carved their initials as teenagers. He felt a physical pain as he signed the papers, as if a part of his own body were being amputated. The money bought them a few more months of fragile hope. Then he sold the lower 40 acres, the most fertile land his grandfather had cleared by hand. That money paid for a new experimental treatment that did nothing but make Martha weaker. The farm shrank, piece by agonizing piece. The Miller legacy was being auctioned off to pay for a war they were destined to lose. The neighbors in Providence Creek watched with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Providence Creek was a town that was itself dying. The young people left for the cities as soon as they could, seeking a life that wasn't dictated by rainfall and crop prices. All that remained were the old-timers, people who remembered Arthur's father and grandfather, who saw Arthur not as a devoted husband fighting for his wife, but as the man who was losing the Miller land. They would see him in the general store, his shoulders stooped, his face etched with a new line of worry each week, and they would whisper, not out of malice, but because in a town with no future, the failures of the past were the only stories left to tell. Mrs. Gable, who ran the store, would watch him over the top of her spectacles as he counted out his change for a loaf of bread and some soup. She'd known him since he was a boy. She saw the ghost of Martha in the hollows of his cheeks. Jedediah, his closest neighbor, a man whose own farm was barely clinging to life, would sometimes stop his truck on the road overlooking Arthur's dwindling property. He'd shake his head, remembering Arthur's father. "A man's land is his soul," he'd mutter to himself. "You sell the land, you sell your soul." They didn't understand the desperation, the all-consuming love that drove Arthur. They saw only the failure, the end of a dynasty, and in their judgment Arthur felt the full, crushing weight of his isolation. He was not just losing his wife and his home, he was losing his place in the only world he had ever known. Into this world of slow decay stepped Silas Croft. Silas wasn't a farmer. He was a predator who smelled blood in the water. He bought failing farms for pennies on the dollar, carved them up into smaller, useless plots, and sold them to city folks looking for a weekend escape. He was a man who saw land not as a living legacy, but as a commodity on a balance sheet. He was the one who bought the last of the Miller farm, the very heart of it, leaving Arthur with only the old farmhouse and a mountain of debt. After Martha finally passed, her last breath a quiet sigh in the house she had loved, Silas was there again, circling. He offered to take the house and clear the debt. When Arthur was finally broken, stripped of everything, Silas was the one who mentioned the old abandoned ranch at the edge of the county. "It's nothing," Silas had said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Been empty for a decade, but it's $10. A place to go." It wasn't an act of kindness. It was the ultimate act of contempt, a final insult to the Miller name. $10 for a tomb. And so, when those impossible flowers bloomed in the dust of that $10 tomb, it wasn't just a miracle. It was an affront to the entire narrative of Arthur's life. His world was governed by loss, by decay, by the slow, inevitable victory of barrenness. Life did not spontaneously erupt from dead soil. Hope did not blossom from absolute despair. Yet, here it was. He began to see the world through new eyes, eyes sharpened by a terrifying secret. He started to work on the ranch, not just out of a need to create a routine, but out of a primal, protective instinct. He cleared away the debris in the barn, creating a cleaner, safer space for Ilara. He fixed a leaky pipe, bringing a trickle of clean water into the barn for the first time in years. He wasn't just tending to a place, he was building a sanctuary. With each passing day, a subtle change began to creep across the barren land. The few drops of silvery liquid that spilled from the bucket each evening were having an effect far beyond the initial patch of wildflowers. The soil near the barn, once the color of pale ash, was slowly darkening, taking on the rich, loamy hue of fertile earth. A few stubborn, skeletal bushes near the fence line began to sprout tiny green leaves, their branches no longer reaching like desperate claws, but unfurling with a tentative life. It was a slow, quiet transformation, almost imperceptible to a casual observer, but to Arthur, a man who knew the language of the land, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Life was returning. The pervasive symbol of his failure, the dry, cracked earth, was beginning to heal under his care. This fragile genesis brought with it a fear more profound than any grief he had ever known. Before, his pain was his own, a private burden, but this secret, this miracle, was not his. He was its guardian, its protector. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his ears straining for the sound of an approaching engine on the long deserted dirt road. Every passing car was a potential threat. Every distant dust cloud on the horizon sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a broken man, a man who had sought only to be forgotten. But now he had something to protect, something precious and incomprehensible. This new purpose was a fragile seedling of hope in the barren field of his heart, and he was terrified that the slightest misstep would see it crushed under the boot of a world that would never understand. He saw the change in Ilara, too. It was as slow and quiet as the greening of the land. She no longer flinched with such violent terror when he approached. There were moments, fleeting as a hummingbird's wing, when he would catch her watching him from the shadows, her eyes filled not just with fear but with a deep, questioning curiosity. She was still a wild thing, a creature of silence and shadow, but he was beginning to see the person trapped within the trauma. He wondered about her story, about the life that had led her to this derelict barn, to a state of such profound isolation that her only way to communicate was through an act that defied nature itself. Who had hurt her? Who had abandoned her here, leaving her to be sold as part of a $10 plot of worthless land? The questions haunted him, but he knew he could not ask them. Their bond was a silent one, forged in a shared space of brokenness and a fragile emerging trust. To speak might be to shatter it, so he contented himself with small acts of care. He found an old, clean blanket in his truck and left it for her. The next day he saw it neatly folded in the corner she had claimed as her own. He started leaving a payo, small bowl of the fresh water he'd managed to get flowing. He was tending to her as he would a frightened, wounded animal, hoping to gentle her, to show her that he was not a threat. In doing so, he was slowly, unconsciously, tending to the wounded parts of himself, the part that had failed to protect Martha, the part that had failed to save his family's legacy. But a secret so vibrant cannot stay buried for long, especially in a place as desolate and watchful as Providence Creek. The ranch that had been a landmark of decay for over a decade was beginning to show faint signs of life. A patch of impossible green in a sea of brown is a thing that gets noticed. A wisp of smoke from a chimney that has been cold for years is a thing that gets discussed. Arthur's quiet, self-imposed exile was about to be interrupted. The world he had tried so desperately to escape was slowly turning its gaze back toward him, drawn by whispers and rumors of something unnatural happening at the old, forgotten place at the end of the world. He stood one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, the same colors as the impossible flowers in his barn. He looked at the small patch of land that was now thriving, an oasis of his own making, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a fragile, terrifying pride. He had a purpose. He was a protector. But as he looked out at the long, empty road leading back to town, a cold dread settled in his stomach. How long? Could a miracle like this stay hidden? What would happen when the greed and suspicion of the outside world finally arrived at his doorstep, demanding to see, to understand, and to possess the impossible life he was so desperately trying to nurture? The quiet ending he had sought was over, and a new, far more dangerous story was just beginning. The fragile peace of the ranch, a sanctuary built on silence and routine, was never destined to last. A secret as vibrant as a field of impossible flowers cannot remain hidden in a land defined by its emptiness. The first crack in their isolated world did not come from a place of malice, but from simple, human curiosity. It came in the form of Jedediah's old, rattling pickup truck, kicking up a plume of dust that Arthur saw from a mile away. Jedediah was his closest neighbor, a man whose own farm was a testament to stubborn persistence against failing soil. He pulled up to the fence line, not getting out, just idling his engine and staring. He was looking at the small patch near the barn, a defiant square of emerald green in a landscape of beige and brown. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He walked out slowly, his hands shoved in his pockets to hide their trembling, and stood on his side of the fence. Jedediah just shook his head, a look of pure bewilderment on his weathered face. "Miller," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. "Heard you were out here. Didn't believe it. What in God's name are you putting in that soil?" "Looks like a piece of heaven fell out of the sky and landed right there." Arthur offered a weak, non-committal shrug. "Just some old family techniques." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Jedediah wasn't buying it, but he was too polite, or perhaps too unsettled, to press further. He just gave a final long look at the impossible green, tipped his hat, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. The visit left Arthur shaken to his core. It was one thing to guard a secret from the abstract world, but it was another to lie to the face of a man he had known his whole life. He felt the fragile bubble of his new existence begin to thin, the pressures of the outside world pressing in. He looked back at the barn where Ilara was hidden, a silent witness to the exchange. He was her protector, her guardian, but what was he really? A broken man with calloused hands and a heart full of ghosts. How could he possibly stand against a world that would inevitably come? Looking for answers. Have you ever held a secret so precious and so fragile that the very act of protecting it felt like holding a butterfly in a clenched fist? You know that any pressure will crush it, but you also know that opening your hand means it will fly away, exposed to a world of predators. That was Arthur's new reality. He was no longer a man seeking an end. He was a man terrified of the beginning he had been given, because he knew with a farmer's certainty that some things are too beautiful to survive discovery. Jedediah's bewilderment did not stay with him. It traveled back to Providence Creek and planted itself in the dry soil of the town's collective consciousness, where it sprouted into 1,000 thorny rumors. In a place starved for news, Arthur Miller's strange reclamation project became the main course. At the general store, Mrs. Gable spoke in hushed tones about how Arthur seemed haunted, not just grieving, but changed, as if he'd seen something out there in the dust that had unmoored him from reality. Men at the barbershop speculated that he'd finally cracked, that the grief over Martha and the loss of the Miller land had sent him spiraling into madness. They painted pictures with their words, a man talking to himself, tending a patch of weeds as if it were a prize-winning garden, a ghost haunting his own self-made grave. The story twisted and grew with each telling. The injustice was subtle, a slow poisoning of his name. He wasn't a man finding a new purpose. He was a tragedy, a cautionary tale, the final pathetic chapter of a once proud family. They pitied him, and in their pity, they rejected him, building a wall of whispers that isolated him more completely than any fence line ever could. It was these whispers, carried on the wind like bitter seeds, that finally reached the ears of Silas Croft. Greed, after all, has the sharpest hearing. One afternoon, Silas's sleek black car, an obscene intrusion of wealth and modernity into the desolate landscape, crunched to a halt in front of the farmhouse. Silas stepped out, his city shoes coated in a fine layer of dust he brushed away with irritation. He wore a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Miller," he boomed, feigning surprise. "Just passing through, thought I'd see how you were settling into your new estate." His eyes, however, weren't on Arthur. They were fixed on the impossible garden, which was now flourishing with vegetables that grew with an unnatural speed and vibrancy. Arthur felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He stood in Silas's path, a silent, ineffective barrier. Silas walked right past him, his gaze sweeping over the rich, dark soil, the lush leaves, the vibrant colors. He wasn't seeing a miracle, he was seeing a product. He was calculating yields, profit margins, market value. He bent down, touching a leaf, his expression one of avaricious wonder. "Remarkable," he murmured, more to himself than to Arthur. "Truly remarkable. You've been holding out on us, Miller. What's your secret?" The fear that had been a low hum in Arthur's blood now screamed. He saw in Silas's eyes the future he dreaded. Ilara, not as a person, but as a resource to be drilled, pumped and bled dry, until she was as barren as the land had once been. He felt a surge of protective fury, an emotion so foreign it almost choked him. "There's no secret," Arthur said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Just hard work." Silas straightened up, his smile gone, replaced by a look of cold reptilian assessment. He knew Arthur was lying. He didn't know how, but he knew this was not the result of hard work alone. This was something else, something valuable. "Is that so?" Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Well, you keep up the hard work. I have a feeling this little $10 ranch is about to become a whole lot more valuable, and I'll be back to discuss my finder's fee." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving behind a threat that hung in the air like the stench of decay. The visit was over, but the war had just been declared. Arthur was left standing there, a scarecrow trying to guard a field of gold from a dragon. The psychological toll of Silas's visit was immediate and devastating. That night Arthur couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sounded like Silas returning. He was consumed by a paralyzing fear, not for himself, but for Ilara. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a farmer, hands meant to nurture and grow things. They felt useless, weak, utterly incapable of defending against the kind of predatory greed Silas represented. The weight of his past failures settled on him like a shroud. He had failed to save his wife. He had failed to save his family's farm. Was he now going to fail to protect this innocent, miraculous creature who had stumbled into his life? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, stabbing guilt in his chest. He felt the familiar, bitter taste of despair, the tempting whisper that told him to just run, to take Ilara and disappear into the night, to find another forgotten corner of the world. But he knew it was a fool's hope. A secret like Ilara couldn't be hidden forever. Sooner or later, the world would find them. From the shadows of the barn, Ilara watched him. She could not understand the words that had passed between Arthur and the man in the shiny black car, but she understood the language of fear. She had lived with it her entire life. She saw the change in Arthur's posture, the way his shoulders slumped with a new, heavier weight. She saw the way he now flinched at every distant sound, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. This fear was a mirror of her own, a reflection of the terror she had felt every day of her life in the care of her family, who had treated her as a shameful deformity. She had begun to feel a fragile sense of safety with Arthur, a quiet corner of the world, where she was not a monster. But the arrival of that other man had shattered the peace, reminding her that the outside world was full of people who would see her gift not as a miracle, but as a thing to be used, caged, or destroyed. Her trust in Arthur was the most delicate seedling, and now the cold shadow of her past was threatening to blot out its sun. A week later, Silas returned. This time, there was no pretense of a friendly visit. He strode onto the property as if he owned it, a clipboard in his hand and a predatory gleam in his eye. "Miller, we need to talk business," he said, not asking for permission. He laid out his vision, a grotesque parody of everything the ranch had become. He spoke of bottling the water, of selling exclusive rights to the produce, of creating a high-end health retreat for the wealthy. He painted a future of contracts, of labs, of marketing campaigns. He spoke of Ilara not by name, but as the asset, the source. He was proposing to industrialize a miracle, to turn a soul into a factory. "You'll be rich, Miller," Silas concluded, as if that were the only thing that could possibly matter. "Richer than your father ever dreamed." It was the ultimate insult, a desecration of his family's memory and of the sacred trust he had built with Ilara. Arthur felt a cold, clear rage settle over him. He looked Silas dead in the eye. "She's not an asset," he said, his voice low and trembling with suppressed fury, "and she is not for sale." For a moment, Silas looked genuinely surprised, as if the concept of refusing wealth was something he couldn't compute. Then his expression hardened into one of pure contempt. "You sentimental old fool," he sneered. "You're sitting on a gold mine, and you want to plant daisies." He took a step closer, invading Arthur's space, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think you can stop me? I sold you this land. I know every loophole in the book. That thing in your barn is a part of this property, and I will have it." He punctuated the sentence with a hard shove to Arthur's chest, sending him stumbling backward. It wasn't just a threat of legal action, it was a promise of physical violence. "This isn't over," Silas spat, turning his back and storming away. "You will regret this." Arthur watched him go, his heart pounding, the spot on his chest where Silas had pushed him burning with humiliation and rage. The line had been drawn. This would not be a battle of wits or words, it would be a battle of wills. And Arthur knew he was hopelessly outmatched. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and brutal. Silas, true to his word, began to turn the screw. He couldn't legally reclaim the property, but he could make Arthur's life a living hell. He went back to Providence Creek and spread a new, more venomous strain of rumor. Arthur Miller wasn't just crazy, he was dangerous. He was a squatter on land that was probably contaminated. He was hiding something, something unnatural. The town, already primed for suspicion, readily accepted this new narrative. The pity they had felt for Arthur curdled into fear and hostility. When he drove into town for supplies, people would literally cross the street to avoid him. Children were pulled inside houses as he passed. At the general store, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had given him cookies as a boy, refused to serve him. "We don't want your kind here, Arthur," she said, her face a cold, hard mask. He was an outcast, a pariah in the only home he had ever known. He was utterly, completely alone, walled off from the world by a fortress of lies and fear that Silas had built. The isolation was a crushing weight. Arthur felt himself beginning to crumble under the relentless pressure. The nights were the worst, filled with nightmares where he saw Silas dragging Ilara from the barn, her eyes pleading with him as he stood by, helpless. He saw the ghost of his father, his face etched with disappointment, not because he had lost the land, but because he was proving to be too weak to protect what mattered. The desire to give up became a constant nagging voice in his head. What was he even doing? He was one man against a world of greed and suspicion. He had no money, no allies, no strength. He would sit on the porch of the dilapidated farmhouse for hours, staring out at the fence line, feeling the last of his hope drain away like water into the thirsty sand. He was on the verge of breaking, of admitting defeat, of accepting that he was, and always had been, a failure. It was on one of those evenings, as dusk settled over the ranch and painted the sky in bruises of purple and orange, that he felt a presence beside him. He didn't have to look. He knew it was Ilara. She had crept from the safety of the barn, a thing he had never seen her do after dark. She stood there for a long moment, a silent shadow in the fading light. Arthur didn't move, too lost in his own despair to speak. Then he felt a delicate touch on his arm. He looked down and saw her hand, thin and smudged with dirt, holding out a single, perfect wildflower, its petals glowing with an almost imperceptible light in the twilight. She didn't say a word. She just held it out to him, her eyes, for the first time, not filled with fear, but with a clear, unwavering expression of trust. It was a simple, silent gesture, but it shattered Arthur's despair. It was not a solution. It was not a plan. It was a reason. It was a reminder of the impossible beauty he was fighting for. He slowly reached out and took the flower, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. In that moment, he knew he could not give up. He would not. His renewed resolve was tested almost immediately. A few nights later, the sound of an engine cut through the midnight silence, not the familiar rattle of Jedediah's truck, but the low, threatening rumble of a vehicle moving without its headlights. Arthur's blood ran cold. He grabbed the heaviest tool he could find, an old, rusty pitchfork, and slipped out the back door, his heart a frantic drum. Two large, shadowy figures were getting out of a dark truck parked just off the road. Silas was with them, pointing towards the barn. This was it. The threats were over. This was brute force. Arthur moved through the darkness, his only thought to get between them and the barn. He was no fighter. He was a farmer, his body weary from years of labor and grief. But as he saw Silas and his hired thugs approach the barn door, a place that had become a sacred sanctuary, something inside him snapped. He stepped out from the shadows, the pitchfork held before him, a pathetic weapon against three men. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice a raw, desperate rasp. Silas just laughed, a cruel, ugly sound in the night. "Your land?" he mocked. "You're just the caretaker, Miller. We've come for the real property." The two men began to advance on him, their intentions brutally clear. Arthur stood his ground, his knuckles white on the wooden handle of the pitchfork, knowing he was about to pay the price for a flower. A silent promise and a single defiant act of hope. The two men moved toward him, their shapes bulky and menacing in the faint starlight. Arthur could smell the stale liquor on their breath, a scent that mingled with the dry dust of his land. He braced himself, the worn wood of the pitchfork a flimsy, pathetic shield. This was how it ended, he thought, not in quiet surrender, but in a brutal, meaningless fight. In the dark, Silas's laughter echoed, a sound that stripped the dignity from the very air they breathed. But as the first man reached for the pitchfork, a new sound cut through the tension, a sound so out of place it froze everyone for a beat. It was the familiar wheezing rattle of an old engine, and a pair of yellow headlights sliced through the darkness, pinning them all like insects in its beam. The truck slowed to a stop at the fence line, its engine idling, a noisy mechanical heartbeat in. The sudden, shocked silence. The confrontation was no longer private. They had a witness. The driver's side door creaked open, and the stooped silhouette of Jedediah emerged into the headlight's glow. He stood there, his face a mask of confusion and concern, his old flannel shirt looking ghostly in the harsh light. He wasn't a threat. He was a farmer, just like Arthur, a man who understood the language of hardship and quiet desperation. Silas, shot a venomous glare towards the truck, his plan for a quick, violent resolution ruined. Jedediah took a few hesitant steps forward, his gaze shifting from the two thugs to Silas, and finally settling on Arthur, who still held the pitchfork with a grip of pure, terrified desperation. "Arthur!" Jedediah's voice was rough, but it carried across the yard, cutting through the thick, menacing atmosphere. "What in God's name is going on out here? I saw the car, figured it was trouble." He wasn't accusing, just asking, but his simple presence had changed the entire equation. A private beating was one thing, a public assault was another. Silas, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury, took a step towards Jedediah. "This is private property, old man," he snarled. "Turn your truck around and mind your own damn business before you get hurt." But Jedediah didn't flinch. He just shook his head slowly, his eyes still on Arthur. "Arthur's business is his business," he said quietly. "But this doesn't look like business. This looks like a jackal cornering its prey." The words, spoken with the simple, unadorned truth of a countryman, hung in the air. At that exact moment, a low, deep rumble echoed from the horizon, a sound that seemed to come from the very chest of the earth. A sudden, cold wind whipped across the yard, carrying the scent of distant rain and something else, something wild and electric. The stars, which had been scattered across the black velvet sky moments before, were rapidly being consumed by a bank of clouds that boiled up from the west with an unnatural speed. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable tension that had nothing to do with the men standing in the yard. The storm did not arrive. It erupted. The first crack of lightning was not a distant flicker, but a violent, blinding fissure that split the sky directly overhead, followed instantly by a deafening clap of thunder that shook the very ground. The world was plunged into a strobe-like chaos of brilliant light and absolute darkness. The two thugs instinctively recoiled, their bravado washed away by a primal fear of the storm's sudden, impossible fury. A torrent of rain followed, not a gentle shower, but a solid wall of water that slammed into the dry earth, turning the dust to instant mud. Silas screamed something, a curse lost in the howling wind, as he was drenched to the bone. This was no ordinary summer squall. It felt like a judgment, a raw, untamable rage unleashed from the heavens, and its focus seemed to be this one small, forgotten patch of land. Through the sheeting rain and the flashes of lightning, Arthur's attention was ripped away from the men. A sound, sharper and more final than the thunder, cut through the din, the agonizing shriek of ancient wood giving way. He looked towards the barn and saw in the next flash of lightning a long, jagged crack appearing in the main support beam of the roof. The structure, which had stood as a monument to decay for years, was finally surrendering to the storm's assault. His heart seized with a terror that dwarfed any fear he had for his own safety. Ilara was in there. She was trapped inside the collapsing heart of their sanctuary. The men, the pitchfork, the fight, all of it dissolved into insignificance. There was only one thing in the world that mattered. He dropped the pitchfork, it clattered into the mud, forgotten. He didn't spare a glance for Silas or his men, who were now scrambling back toward their car, their violent intentions washed away by the storm's overwhelming power. Arthur ran. He ran through the blinding rain, his boots slipping in the slick mud, his lungs burning. He ran towards the groaning, dying barn, every fiber of his being screaming a single, silent prayer. He burst through the wide doors just as another section of the roof gave way, sending a cascade of rotted timber and debris crashing down onto the very spot where she usually hid. For a terrifying second, he thought he was too late. Then he saw her, huddled against the far wall, her body trembling uncontrollably, her face pale with a terror so absolute she was frozen, unable to move or even cry out. She was paralyzed by the storm, a living statue in the heart of the chaos. In that moment, Arthur Miller, the man who had lost everything, the man who had failed to save his wife, the man who had come here to die, acted with a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in a decade. There was no thought, only instinct. He crossed the treacherous floor, scooped her into his arms. She was impossibly light, like a bird, and turned without a word, carrying her back out into the raging storm. He didn't run back toward the safety of Jedediah's truck. He ran towards the farmhouse, the house he had kept locked and sterile, a museum of his grief for Martha. It was a sacred, untouchable space. But as the rain plastered his hair to his head and he held the trembling form of Ilara against his chest, he knew that old life was over. He was crossing a threshold, not just of a doorway, but of his own heart. He kicked open the front door and carried her inside, out of the storm, into the quiet, still heart of his past. He gently set her down on the clean, polished floor of the living room. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and old memories. For a moment they just stood there, dripping water onto Martha's favorite rug, the only sounds the drumming of the rain on the roof and their own ragged breaths. He looked around at the room, at the photographs of him and Martha on the mantelpiece, at the armchair where she used to read, and he felt a pang of guilt, as if he had committed a great betrayal. But when he looked back at Ilara, he saw not a creature, not a miracle, but a terrified young woman, her eyes wide as she took in the strange, safe world of the house. The symbol of his past failure, the barrenness of this home, was now holding the very source of his new purpose. It felt both wrong and profoundly right. And if it were, would you have the courage to face everyone down to protect a single fragile soul against the judgment of the entire world? She took a hesitant step, then another, her gaze fixed on his face. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else, something deeper. She opened her mouth, and for the first time, her voice was not a dry, terrified whisper, but a clear, soft sound that cut through the silence of the house. "My name," she said, her voice trembling, slightly with disuse, "is Ilara." The name, a simple, beautiful word, landed in the quiet room with the force of a revelation. It gave her a history, an identity. It transformed her from the secret in his barn into the person in his home. In that instant, Arthur's fight was no longer about protecting a strange gift or a patch of land. It was about protecting Ilara. He looked at her, truly looked at her as a person for the first time, and saw the immense, terrifying weight of the responsibility he had just fully accepted. Outside, the storm began to pass as quickly as it had arrived. The roar of the wind softened to a sigh, the hammering rain to a gentle patter. The violent, cleansing fury was over. He knew, without looking, that Silas and his men would be gone, driven off by the storm and the inconvenient presence of a witness. A fragile, temporary peace settled over the ranch, but Arthur felt no relief. He felt only a cold, sharp clarity. This was not the end. It was a reprieve. He had won a single battle, not through strength, but through a chaotic act of nature. Silas was not a man to be deterred by a storm. He would be back, more determined, more ruthless. Arthur looked at Ilara, standing in the center of his life, a fragile beacon of impossible hope. He had saved her from the storm, but what was coming for them was a hurricane of human greed, and what was to come would be the most decisive night of her life. The days following the storm were draped in a strange, fragile quiet. The world outside the farmhouse seemed to hold its breath, the air washed clean, the earth drinking deeply from the deluge. Inside, the silence was different. It was no longer the heavy, grief-soaked silence of Martha's museum. It was a shared space, a tentative quiet filled with the presence of another soul. Ilara, whose name now felt as solid and real as the wooden floor beneath their feet, moved through the house with a ghost's caution, her eyes taking in the artifacts of a life she could not comprehend. She would touch the edge of a faded photograph, her fingers tracing the smile of a woman she would never know, her expression a mixture of wonder and a deep, innate sadness. Arthur watched her, his heart a tangle of conflicting emotions. He had brought the wild, miraculous heart of the ranch into the sterile, preserved heart of his past, and he did not know if the house was saving her or if she was saving the house. He knew their peace was a borrowed thing, a brief. Calm in the eye of a hurricane he could feel gathering just beyond the horizon. Silas was not gone. Men like Silas did not simply disappear. Their greed was a patient, stalking predator. Arthur spent his days reinforcing the fences, his nights lying awake, listening to the sounds of the dark. Every rustle of leaves a potential threat. He was no longer a man waiting to die. He was a sentry, a guardian of a life far more precious than his own. He and Ilara developed a new routine, one based on spoken words, however few. He taught her the names of the vegetables in the garden, which had exploded with an even more impossible vitality after the storm. She, in turn, showed him things he had never noticed, the way a particular flower followed the sun, the intricate patterns on a beetle's back. She was teaching him to see the world again, not as a ledger of losses, but as a tapestry of small, vibrant miracles. The garden had become a paradise, a defiant Eden carved out of the desolate landscape. The colors were so vivid they seemed to hum, the air so thick with the scent of growth and life it was intoxicating. It was a testament to their strange partnership, a physical manifestation of the hope that had taken root in both their broken souls. It was in this garden, on a bright, cloudless afternoon, that the hurricane finally made landfall. Silas's black car appeared at the end of the road, not sneaking in the dark, but with the brazen arrogance of a conqueror. He was not alone. Two large, hard-faced men got out with him, their posture radiating a casual brutality that made the hair on Arthur's arms stand up. They did not stop at the fence. They walked directly into the garden, their heavy boots crushing the delicate plants underfoot with a contemptuous indifference. Arthur moved to stand between them and the farmhouse, where Alara had been tending to a row of tomato plants. She froze at the sight of them, the color draining from her face, her body language, instantly reverting to that of the feral, cornered creature he had first found in the barn. Silas smirked, his eyes sweeping over the lush abundance with a possessive gleam. He ignored Arthur, speaking directly to the space where Alara stood. "It's time to go," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "We have a lot of work to do, a lot of money to make." He was not speaking to a person. He was speaking to a commodity, a piece of equipment he had come to collect. Arthur felt a rage so pure and cold. It burned away all his fear. He planted his feet in the rich, dark soil, the soil Alara had created. "You are not taking her," he said, his voice low and steady. Silas finally turned his attention to Arthur, his expression one of bored annoyance, as if swatting away a fly. "Still playing the noble fool, Miller? I gave you a chance. Now I'm just taking what's mine." He nodded to his men. "Get it." The two men began to advance, their movements slow, deliberate, confident. Arthur knew this was it. The moment he had been dreading, the moment his own inadequacy would be laid bare. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting around for anything, any weapon. His gaze fell upon the old, rusty pitchfork he had used the night of the storm, leaning against the side of the farmhouse where he'd left it. It was a pathetic tool against these men, but it was all he had. He grabbed it, the familiar weight of the wood a small, cold comfort in his trembling hands. "I'm warning you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Stay back!" The men just laughed. It was a hollow, ugly sound that desecrated the peaceful air of the garden. They fanned out, flanking him. Arthur felt a wave of dizzying terror. He saw the ghost of his father, his face stern and disappointed. He saw Martha, her eyes full of a sad pity. He had failed them. He had lost their land, and now he was going to lose this, the one thing that had given him a reason to live again. His moral choice was no choice at all. He could not surrender her. To do so would be to surrender the last tattered remnant of his own soul. His survival was meaningless if it meant her damnation. He lunged forward, a desperate, clumsy roar tearing from his throat, aiming the pitchfork not to kill, but to drive them back. The fight, if it could be called that, was short and brutal. One of the men sidestepped his clumsy attack with ease, grabbing the handle of the pitchfork and twisting it from his grasp with a wrench of force that sent a searing pain through Arthur's wrists. The tool clattered uselessly to the ground. The other man struck him hard in the stomach, a single professional blow that knocked the wind from his lungs and sent him staggering to his knees. He gasped for air, the world tilting, the vibrant colors of the garden blurring at the edges. He looked up, his vision swimming, and saw them moving past him, their target clear. They were walking towards Alara, who stood paralyzed with a lifetime of terror, her face a white mask of silent screaming. He had failed. It was over. The despair was a physical weight, crushing him into the very earth he had tried so hard to protect. But as the men reached for her, something shifted. It was a change in Alara herself. Her paralysis broke, replaced by a sudden, fierce clarity. Her eyes, which had been wide with the fear of a victim, narrowed with the resolve of a survivor. She looked past the men, her gaze locking with Arthur's, who was still on his knees in the dirt. That look, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. It was a look of gratitude, of apology, and of a profound, earth-shaking decision. She was no longer a frightened creature to be sheltered. She was a force to be reckoned with. She would not let him be broken for her. She would not be taken. This was her home, this was her garden, and she would defend it. She turned away from Arthur and knelt, not in surrender but in communion. She pressed the palms of her hands flat against the rich, dark soil. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. A low, resonant hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very core of the planet. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. a gentle tremor that quickly grew in intensity. Silas, who had been watching with a triumphant smirk, took a nervous step back, his expression shifting from greed to confusion, and then to a dawning horror. The two thugs stopped in their tracks, looking down at the trembling earth as if it had turned to water beneath their boots. This was not an earthquake. This was something else, something intentional. Then the earth erupted. It was not a violent explosion, but a surge of impossible, directed life. From the soil around Silas's men, thick, thorny vines, the color of deep forest green and studded with thorns like obsidian daggers, burst forth with silent, terrifying speed. They were not random. They moved with a clear, undeniable purpose. They coiled around the men's ankles, their legs, their chests, their arms, pulling them off balance and dragging them to the ground. The men yelled in shock and pain, struggling against the vines, but their efforts were useless. The more they fought, the tighter the living tendrils constricted, not with enough force to crush, but with an unyielding pressure that rendered them completely immobile. It was a powerful, irrefutable act of defense. Silas stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of disbelief and primal fear. He had come to harvest a resource, and the resource was harvesting him. A single powerful vine, thicker than the others, shot from the ground at his feet. It did not ensnare him. Instead, it rose up like a serpent, its thorny tip hovering inches from his face, a clear and silent threat. Silas scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and falling hard into a bed of crushed marigolds. He stared at the vine, then at Ilara, who was still kneeling, her hands pressed to the earth, her face serene, her eyes closed. He finally understood. He was not dealing with a freak of nature. He was dealing with nature itself, and he had trespassed in the most grievous way imaginable. The terror broke him. He let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure animalistic fear, and crawled backward through the dirt, crab-like, his expensive suit ruined, his dignity shredded. He scrambled to his feet and ran. He did not look back. He ran with the kind of desperation born from staring into the face of something so far, beyond your comprehension, that it shatters your entire worldview. The two thugs, seeing their employer abandon them, began to beg, their voices high and pleading. Ilara opened her eyes. She lifted her hands from the soil, and as she did, the deep hum faded, and the vines relaxed their grip. They did not retreat back into the earth. They simply loosened. Their purpose served, leaving the two men lying in the dirt, panting, covered in scratches, their bravado completely extinguished. They wasted no time. They scrambled up and followed their boss, their terrified flight a far more eloquent statement than any threat they had ever uttered. A profound silence descended upon the garden, broken only by the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The thorny vines remained, a silent, powerful testament to what had happened. Arthur slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his mind reeling. He looked at Ilara, who had also risen. She was no longer trembling. She stood tall, her shoulders back, a quiet strength radiating from her that he had never seen before. She was not a monster. She was not a victim. She was the guardian of this place, and she had just claimed her power. He walked towards her, his steps unsteady, and stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say, what to do. The world had been turned upside down, and then set right again in the space of a few heartbeats. She closed the distance between them. She reached out, her small, dirt-smudged hand gently touching the bruise that was already forming on his cheek. Her touch was not a question, but a statement. It was a thank you. It was an apology for the pain he had endured for her. It was a promise that he would never have to fight for her alone again. In that simple, silent gesture, the last wall between them crumbled. He was not her keeper, and she was not his secret. They were partners. They were family. Two solitary, broken souls who had found in each other the one thing neither of them had ever truly had, a home. The aftermath was quieter than Arthur could have ever imagined. Silas Croft and his men were never seen in Providence Creek again. The story they told, if they told one at all, was likely so incoherent and terrified that it was dismissed as madness. But their sudden, panicked departure did not go unnoticed. The next day, Jedediah's truck rattled up the road. He got out, his face etched with worry, and walked right up to Arthur. "Saw that black car tear out of here yesterday like the devil himself was on his tail," he said, his eyes scanning the garden, now clear of the defensive vines which had receded back into the earth as silently as they had appeared. "You all right, Arthur?" Arthur just nodded, a slow, tired smile touching his lips. "We're all right, Jedediah. We're fine." Jedediah looked from Arthur to Ilara, who stood a little ways behind him, no longer hiding in the shadows. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He saw the quiet strength in Ilara's posture, the fierce protective calm in Arthur's eyes. He saw the paradise they had built. He just nodded, a deep, knowing understanding passing between the two old farmers. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." And when Jedediah went back to town, he brought with him a new story. He told everyone at the general store not of miracles or monsters, but of how Arthur Miller, a man they had all written off as a broken fool, had stood his ground against a city predator, and won. He told them how Arthur was reclaiming not just the land, but his own dignity, with a quiet strength that would have made his father proud. The town's narrative began to shift. The whispers of madness and danger were replaced by murmurs of respect. The fear curdled into a collective shame for how they had treated him. One morning, when Arthur drove into town for supplies, people didn't cross the street. A few men tipped their hats, and as he stood at the counter in the general store, Mrs. Gable pushed a small warm paper bag towards him. Inside were 2 freshly baked cookies, the kind she used to give him when he was a boy. "It's good to have you back, Arthur," she said, her eyes full of a sincere, unspoken apology. He was no longer an outcast. He was one of them again. His name, the Miller name, was no longer a synonym for failure, but for a resilience they hadn't expected. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, a rhythm of peace and purpose. The threat was gone. The secret was safe. Arthur and Ilara worked side by side in the garden, their days measured by the rising and setting of the sun, their conversations a comfortable mix of words and silences. He learned her story, a tale of isolation and fear, and she learned his, a story of grief and loss. They were the walking wounded, 2 souls who had been discarded by the world, but in the rich, fertile soil of their shared sanctuary, they had found a way to heal. The ranch was no longer a tomb or a hideout. It was a home, vibrant and alive, a testament to the fact that the most barren places can produce the most beautiful blooms. Arthur would sometimes stand on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the sky, Ilara quietly beside him. He would look at the flourishing land, at the woman who was the heart of it all, and he would feel a sense of peace so profound it felt like a prayer. He had come here seeking an ending, a final, quiet surrender to the barrenness that had consumed his life. Instead, he had found a beginning. He had learned that a man's worth is not measured by the land he owns, but by the life he nurtures. He had learned that family is not just a matter of blood, but of the bonds you forge in the dirt and the darkness, protecting each other from the storms. 2 barren hearts, one cracked by grief, the other by fear, had found a way to bloom together, creating a life more beautiful than either could have ever imagined alone. How often are we judged by the world for the secrets we carry, for the parts of us that don't fit into a neat and tidy box? How many times is a person's unique gift treated like a curse, their light hidden away in the shadows of shame and misunderstanding? Ilara's story is a whisper of a truth that lives in so many of us. The fear that if people knew who we truly were, they would see a monster, a commodity, or a fool. But her story is also a promise. It is a promise that even in the most desolate corners of our lives, when we are sold for nothing and left for dead, the right person can come along and see not a curse, but a miracle waiting to be nurtured. It is a promise that our deepest nature, when unleashed not for violence, but for the protection of what we love, holds a power that greed and cruelty can never defeat. Arthur's journey reminds us that redemption is not found in reclaiming what we have lost, but in having the courage to care for what we find. His hands, which had failed to hold on to a legacy of land and profit, were the perfect hands to cultivate a legacy of kindness and protection. He found his purpose not by looking back at the ghosts of his past, but by opening the door of his heart to the impossible stranger who appeared in his present. Their story is a testament to the quiet, unyielding power of nurturing. In a world that so often seeks to exploit, to conquer, and to profit, the greatest strength, the most profound victory, is found in the simple, sacred act of helping something, or someone, to grow. It is the victory of the garden over the machine, of compassion over greed, of life over the slow, creeping death of despair. and so we leave them there, in their quiet paradise, a man and a woman who became a family, their story now woven into the fabric of the land itself, a story of how two barren hearts in the most unlikely of places learned to bloom. And it asks us a final, lingering question. What barren ground in your own life is waiting for a single, impossible drop of rain? What part of you, hidden away in the dark, is waiting for someone to see its value not as something to be used, but as something to be cherished? The world is full of forgotten ranches and lonely souls, but it is also, always, full of the possibility of a miraculous, life-altering bloom. If this story has spoken to a truth within you, if you have ever felt misunderstood, or have witnessed a moment that changed the entire landscape of your life, I invite you to share a piece of that feeling. Write in the comments below, I have also experienced a turning point, because every story of renewal shared is another flower planted in the world's garden, a reminder to us all that even after the longest drought, rain will eventually come.